This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Andrej Verity is a disaster responder and information management officer for the United Nations and co-founder of the Digital Humanitarian Network. He has deployed to many high-profile emergencies while also leading innovation around humanitarian information management and managing the UN's collaboration with the volunteer and technical communities. Most recently, his work has supported and focused on how big data in crisis, microtasking, and artificial intelligence can improve disaster response. Andrej openly shares his ideas in the hope of finding energetic collaborative partners to help move the humanitarian community forward at blog.veritythink.com. I spoke with Andrej in Geneva. Hi there, Andrej. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Thanks, Stephen. It's an honor. Great pleasure to be here.
We have this crystal clear, wonderful connection, so I'm wondering, where are you sitting today?
I am sitting in Geneva in Switzerland today.
And we're recording this on April 22nd, so I'm assuming that it's springtime there and everybody's excited to be done with winter.
That is exactly correct. There's some nice weather these days, and a lot of people are anxious to get out there and enjoy the weather.
Andrej, I'm interested in figuring out how it is that you came to be sitting in Switzerland right now. Can you tell us about what it is that you do and who you work for and the initiatives you work on right now?
Yeah, okay. So what puts me in Switzerland is I'm working for, the United Nations in general, but specifically there's an office that we refer to as the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. For those in the humanitarian space, simply known as OCHA. Within this organization, my specialty before that is really around information, data, information systems development, and implementation of that in a variety of contexts. And the team that I work for here in Geneva, what we do is we actually support and provide services to the different OCHA field offices with a focus on the information staff in those 30 plus locations around the world. We work on a variety of things ranging from global policy to training to helping with staffing in those fields. But my specific role within this team is more, let's say, coming from a technical development background. I work on certain initiatives. One of the big ones that I'm working on right now is something called Humanitarian ID, and looking at how we as a community can more easily manage simple things like contact lists in an emergency. And I also work with, I see other people that you've had on your podcast, people like Patrick Meyer, where we co-founded things like the Digital Humanitarian Network. And within my role, working on topics of how do we bring new technology in to leverage during the times of crises, how do we bring in new processes, new solutions, and introduce that through our information management officers or when I deploy myself to emergencies around the world.
It sounds like a fascinating job to show up to every day. How'd you get here? Are you a tech guy who stumbled into the development world? Are you a development guy who figured out tech? Or take us through that process of how you got into humanitarian aid work.
It's a bit of a longer story, but essentially the short story, a bit more of the tech kind of guy that got into the humanitarian space. The longer story, I came out of university as a business graduate in the computer science field and worked in private consulting for a few years and actually followed my wife, who had taken a job in the Philippines. And I literally went door knocking and landed a job in the UN Development Program. They were wanting to do some technical work, and I had those skills. And it was a very forward-thinking individual there who said, these are some really exciting projects we want to do. And some of the work that I did there, I saw that 9 years later that those solutions were still standing. So we were very much ahead of curve for what people imagined the regular sort of humanitarian and development agencies would do. But that wasn't when I was sort of sold. I jumped out. I ended up working in some different countries, and I went back to the UN actually. This is a story people often ask me is how I got in. Is I went and I worked in North Korea, and this is a time when the UN Development Program wanted some specific work done, and they couldn't find somebody to actually willing to go to North Korea, and they reached out, and I was living in New Zealand at the time, and I said absolutely, and I jumped back in.
Tell me why couldn't they find people to go to North Korea? What was the problem there?
Well, at the time they were looking for they wanted a very technically skilled and project management type individual. So they're looking for this very specific kind of profile. And they had looked through the rosters that they had, and they simply couldn't find anyone. They didn't articulate to me, but my guess is that nobody was willing to go to North Korea. This is 2002, so things were still kind of unknown. It was about the country. There was no real easy connection in and out, and it was around the same time as they announced that they had nuclear weapons. So there's a lot of fear about
So
the country.
it was a fun time to get on an airplane and go to.
Yes, it definitely was. There, you could only imagine some of the phone calls I got from family when they heard I'd accepted this and the things that were going on in the news. But it provided, it was just a fantastic experience. And because I was, in some ways, I tell people, because I was willing to go somewhere that many other people weren't, it provided an easier opportunity to get into that space. So this was a country for me that, although I was working from the development side on a very technical project, I was surrounded by a humanitarian case, and we had OCHA there, and World Food Program was quite large. So it was sort of my first professional exposure to the humanitarian space. Later on, was offered a job with OCHA in New York, and I got there with a short-term job, but that's where I realized that, hey, this is a really interesting space. OCHA really understands and prioritizes the need for information specialists, and I realized, hey, this is fantastic. I can use my sort of tech knowledge, business understanding, apply it to an organization that's working on humanitarian issues. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, it makes it very easier to wake up in the morning and go to a job that both you enjoy and, for an organization that is trying to do good in the world.
One of the things we like to talk about here in terms of references, navigating that leap moment, right? So you stumbled into UNDP, that was development work, then you backed out of it for a while. But you said you followed your wife to the Philippines. Did she follow you to North Korea, or did you guys decide to sort of do some long distance stuff for a while, or how did that work out, and how were you able to sort of take that decision to make the leap? Obviously, it was fascinating, and the work was great, but that's a big commitment.
Yeah, it definitely is. And we were actually in New Zealand at the time and prepared to stay long term and had work that was lined up for that. And I like the way that my wife tells the story is that she's never seen me so excited. And so she said that there was, one time she was never going to question a decision that I made. And she's very much sort of the adventurous person we both are. We want to see the world, we want to travel and so on. So she was like, yes, I'm going. And she came along. There was no problem. The visa was arranged. And because of the challenges of getting people in, it's a small community. But when you bring in someone like my wife who's skilled, there are organizations that are, let's say, hungry in some ways. Maybe that's a bad analogy for North Korea, but very much looking for people to help them. And she ended up working for a couple different organizations, but spent most of the time there working for UNICEF as a communications officer, and has continued working with them part-time ever since. So in some ways, it brought her into the sort of semi-humanitarian development world as well.
That's a great story. I'm glad to hear that you guys were able to make it work as a couple. I've been in this business 12 years myself, and that's one of the biggest challenges for couples is how do you make it work at the same time? So I guess North Korea is one of those places for everybody listening.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's one of those funny cases where people are worried about it, but it's amazingly safe as a foreigner to be in there, and it worked out. And you're right. I have colleagues around the world who, living separate from their spouse, living separate from their family for months or years at a time, and no one pretends that that's easy. And that is definitely one of the challenges of both humanitarian, but also the development world. Mm-hmm.
So take us back to what you're working on right now. You've been at OCHA for a while, and now you're working on this humanitarian ID initiative. Give us a little bit of flavor of what exactly does that do, and where are you at in the development process, and who's using it, and learn a little bit more about that.
So humanitarian ID, the story behind this, and the general concept, the very, very generalized concept is it's an approach to try to solve the contact list management problem that we face. Now, to give you an idea of where this
give us some color about why is that a problem?
Exactly. Okay, so I'll tell you my story. The first time I had to oversee the management of a contact list, I deployed to Haiti in 2010 to the earthquake, and one of the things I had to oversee was managing the humanitarian contact list. So this is trying to get a contact list of all the responders in country. Now, at the beginning of any, especially major emergencies, this is relatively easy. So in the Haiti case, we set up a reception space at the airport. We have another reception space where many of the large organizations are operating from, and people come to us because they're looking for information. They've landed, they've just arrived, they want to know, they want the latest situation report, they want the latest map, they want when is the next meeting. So they will come to us. We can collect their information. However, at about probably 2 weeks, 3 weeks into an emergency, people start leaving, and it becomes very difficult to keep that contact list up to date. And so we often end up with information that's incorrect. And the example I had when it really hit me was I was running the reception space at one point one day, and I had an individual walk in, and he said, okay, I'm looking for a very specific person. Let's call this person John Smith, and he's working at WHO, the World Health Organization. And I said, okay, well, let's see. And we went through the contact list. We had it printed out, and we had about 10 to 15 colleagues from WHO. And he said, but the person is not here. I said, well, unfortunately, but here's 10 to 15 people that you could try calling or contact them. Here's the office location. You could go over there. And the individual, he just completely lost it. I've never heard so many profanities directed towards myself in my life. And between that and a couple other cases, I said, this really needs to change. I mean, people need to be in an emergency, and they need to be able to contact other responders, whether it's individuals dealing with health nearby. They need to be able to find each other, they need to be able to connect with each other, and they need to be able to do that with a trusted solution. So after Haiti, I was starting to think, I said, this has to be a different way. And this is the age when Foursquare was starting to come about, and Facebook Places, and sort of the check-in, check-out concept, or the checking into locations. So I said, well, let's see if we can do a bit of a version of that, where we're not checking into Starbucks on your corner, but you're checking into a general emergency in a country. And that's where the humanitarian ID concept came from. And we had a couple of consultants come in and think through the problem. And where we're at now is we got the solution in the late phases of development. The website, the informational website, is actually online at just simply humanitarian.id. We are piloting in the Philippines right now, and I was out there probably about a month ago, and actually a little bit less than maybe a month ago, and we've got about 500 responders in the Philippines who are now signed up. So the Philippines contact list has about 520 people, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And these people are then managing their own details on the contact list. And so if they change their phone number, they change their email address, they can go in and change that. And that's automatically changed on any of the contact lists. And that's on the printed contact list. That's changed on a website called Humanitarian Response, which uses it. And it's changed on the Humanitarian ID contact list. And if those responders leave, and we already know of a couple individuals who left the Philippines and went to Nigeria for the response there, they simply log into Humanitarian ID, hit checkout, and it removes them from the Philippines contact list. And then they check into Nigeria. So this is really, let's say, decentralizing the management of the contact list. Of course, there's OCHA staff, humanitarian clusters, organizations will all have management or edit abilities to help with that sort of maintenance and ensuring that people are updating their contacts. And then what we're doing is we're probably about 3 weeks, 3 weeks to the end of this first big development cycle. After that point, we will start rolling it out globally, but focused on the OCHA field offices. So you visit the website now. It talks about the Philippines pilot. The team in Vanuatu is starting to use it. But yeah, we will start rolling it out. It'll be open for anyone to use beginning around mid-May. And then we will very quickly after that also start rolling into another round of development where we want to add additional features, let's say incentives for people to join. So signing up for email lists, notifications, more alerts and reminders for people to check out, and then at the same time building what I'll call the native mobile applications so that you'll be able to install it. If you have a smartphone, install it on your smartphone. It'll synchronize. It'll work completely offline. So we're really thinking about those early days or those times where the internet connection is quite poor. And from Haiti to Guyane after Haiyan, I recognize that the internet connection, even as much as we have great colleagues in emergency telecoms clusters and the mobile phone partners, it takes time for good and reliable internet connection to come back online. So we definitely the next step is we want to have a mobile application that allows this all to work offline.
I can, over the last 3 minutes here, everyone can hear how passionate you are about this. And it's interesting how, it's a simple, for lack of a better term, a simple contact list. What's the biggest challenge here that you're facing with this tool? Is it going to be promoting it, just getting people to be aware of it? Is it going to be using it? Is it going to be the uptake? What are the big challenges that you're facing right now, even in your pilots?
Yeah, I mean, well, okay, the pilot in the Philippines was, let's say it's going to be easier. We recognize it's going to be easier than in other locations simply because I was able to go out and spend time with senior managers of different organizations and the humanitarian country teams and the resident coordinator, and training directly with the OCHA staff who are going to support it. Now, in future cases, this will have to be done remotely. We'll rely on the information management officers and partners to promote it in country. But I'm not too worried about that, because I think what happens is, although we have to get over and promote and get people to understand it, what people quickly realize is this isn't an OCHA tool that we're trying to force onto another organization. This isn't some magnificent, solve all problems tool. It's very focused, and it very much is focused on individuals. So what we're trying to do is, yes, Stephen, you could go in, manage your contact details on the phone or on the application and the contact list. You'll be able to check yourself out. You will soon be able to add yourself to different email lists. You can find my details. It doesn't matter which organizations we're with. We're trying to enable this on an individual level. You will be able to build your own favorites contact list.
Is that one of the biggest challenges you see in the humanitarian universe right now, that proprietary ownership of solutions and proprietary ownership of responses from different organizations? Is that a real big challenge that needs to be overcome?
Well, there is a challenge there. And if you look at something like Humanitarian ID or Humanitarian Response, these are projects managed by OCHA, but very much intentionally not branded as OCHA. We're trying to make it aware that these are community projects. We'll work with partners for integration, and we actually are with Humanitarian ID. But yes, there is always this challenge of each organization, each humanitarian cluster wants to build its own solutions and wants to brand it in its own way. And there's multiple different reasons why that happens. And it is definitely a challenge. I don't know if you want to call it a benefit or not, but one thing with Humanitarian ID is, in some ways, because as you mentioned, it seems like a simple problem to solve, nobody else has been solving it within the different organizations or even the clusters. When I go out and meet, I remember meeting with the World Health Organization in the Philippines, and they're like, yes, we need this. We need this for our own organization. Please give us this solution. We need this as our own, from our own organization. And I got the same kind of message from a variety of different organizations. So I think it's a problem that people face as individuals. They face it as an organization, and they want some kind of solution. So we're really going out, having solved, I think, what people usually think is a simple problem. We're going out trying to solve this problem that they can identify with personally, and they don't jump to, oh, this is OCHA trying to force us to use a tool. This is OCHA trying to help me solve an individual problem that I know that I have every emergency. It isn't OCHA demanding more information. It isn't my headquarters demanding more information. We're just trying to make your life a little bit easier. And once they see it, they realize how easy it is. You register, you provide a little bit of details, and when you check in, it creates a copy of that, and you just customize it with your local phone number, your local title, and voila, you're done. It doesn't take hours. It doesn't take a whole bunch of writing and consolidations. This is information you know about yourself. You can get it on the system, and you can quickly find others. So, yeah, I think the big thing is we're trying to solve an individual problem versus, say, organizational problems. Sure.
What's the funding structure like this? I mean, if OCHA is running it, who's paying for this? How does and what's the sustainability of it over time?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big question, and I'll say that we have the funding. This is being completely funded from OCHA. There is money there. That was one of the big things I started before, or that I wanted clarity before we really started this project. So there was a lot of investigation work happened beforehand, but then, I wanted confirmation from management that there was money for this. I wanted confirmation that there was going to be continued money and support for this. And that's what I've got from my senior management in this case. Historically, I talked about this concept being born shortly after 2010, and it took a few years because when I came out, I had an intern actually doing some work to sort of proof of concept to show that it could be done, so I could show management such a concept was possible. We had another organization or entity look at trying to build this, and they put only a small amount of money and couldn't support it, and we knew it wouldn't work. So then I took it back, the concept back into the Humanitarian Response.info platform, and we tested a little bit of this sort of check-in, check-out concept through that, just as a bit of a proof of concept, until OCHA was willing to commit the money. And now that we've got that money secured for a more sustained management and development, this is why I'm comfortable enough going out and piloting and selling it and really pushing it organization-wide.
Is there, tell us about, is there another technology that you've put out there or another initiative that you've been a part of that just sort of didn't work at all? I mean, this one seems to, you've gone through all of those sort of baby step phases of, here's the idea, can we do proof of concept, and now it's sort of flourishing. Has there been something that's fallen flat out on its face that you've learned from and, you're making sure you don't make those same mistakes now?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't want to speak for everyone, but I think people would be lying if they didn't say that they'd had something fail in the past, especially if you're in the tech space. Yeah, I think one of the biggest ones for me, I say the more recent one that was a big one was a couple of years ago. OCHA decided that it wanted to build something called a sort of a coordinated requesting tool. And the idea was that any office could go in, specify what information it needed from our humanitarian partners, and the system would magically send emails out to all of them. They would come onto the system, they'd fill in the details. And
I love that. Online. Sounds beautiful.
Of course, it does. And that's exactly it. Management was completely sold. We need this technical solution, and the technical solution was going to do everything. And I remember speaking to management at the time, and I said, be very careful about taking this on, because building the technical tool to this is one thing. Making it work and function in the field where the internet's really poor, where people are used to their own processes, is a whole nother question. But the decision was made. No, they said, Andrej, go and build this technical tool. So I said, okay, great. And then they gave me a little bit of money. We hired a short-term developer, and we developed something. And we said, okay, great, we got it. And they said, okay, go run it in the field. So we took it out to a couple offices, and what I found there is a more or less expected was all of a sudden they wanted, well, we need a copy of the email request in our sent box, and I need this information to come to my inbox, and all of a sudden they wanted essentially email replicated along with Google Documents replicated. And I said, well, organizations like Google, they're multi-billion-dollar organizations. That's how come they can make email and collaborative documents. And I said to management, I said, there's just no way. And part of it is we're busy here now trying to replicate collaborative tools. We're trying to replicate email, and we've got a budget in the tens of thousands instead of in the multiple millions or billions. So that project just died. As wonderful as the concept is, and there's a couple offices playing with some similar approaches in the field, so it may eventually come back. But as wonderful as the concept was, the sort of the base wasn't there. And what I mean by that was there was no consistency in our offices in terms of how they requested. There was no consistency in when they requested. There was no consistency in what information they were requesting and what structure they wanted that information back in. So adding a tool onto something that doesn't exist already is really, really difficult. Because then all of a sudden you're telling people, no, you can no longer use your email, which is something you've been using for the last 10, 15, 20 years. And now we want you to go over here and use this completely new tool. And it's a huge change for people. And so we learned a lot out of that one, and we applied the learnings when I went to the Philippines after Haiyan. One of the things I said was, we're not going to use a tool to request information from the clusters, but from the humanitarian partners and clusters, I said, here is when I'm going to request this information from you. I'm going to request that you submit it to me every Tuesday and every Friday for the next 3 weeks. After that, we will go once a week. And this here is the fields and the data that I want you to submit to me. And that's it. And so we were just completely predictable. And I told them, you can manage your own systems. I don't care how you have your data. We want you to give it to us in this example, in Excel with these columns, or as close to that as you possibly can.
So you kept it simple and structured.
Yes. And the thing was, when you started speaking to different people and what the problem was, is it actually sounded like our partners were feeling that OCHA was not coordinated, because we would have somebody in the office who would be asking for who's doing what, where information. You'd have another person asking for project information for a pooled fund, which was very similar to the who's doing what, where. And you'd have OCHA asking for an update to the semi-annual update to the UN and Humanitarian Response Plan. And there would be a lot of overlap of information, but OCHA would ask for that same information in one meeting. And so you'd have 3 different people from OCHA asking the same group of people for what looks like the same data, but 3 different ways. And so people would sit there and think, my gosh, OCHA's not even coordinated in how they ask us for information. So it wasn't that we needed a tool. It was that we needed to, in some ways, better coordinate ourselves and better structure how we ask for information. After that, then we can start adding in tools. So this is where with Humanitarian ID, you hear me sometimes grumble about how long it took from 2010 to 2015. But in many ways, in between that, the sort of the testing and the pilot, or not pet piloting, but sort of testing in different ways and really scoping out the concept and understanding mobile and separations of data and API, all this kind of stuff, structuring that, we really got to a place that in 2014, when we hired the technical firm, we knew exactly what we wanted. So it was very well articulated for that tech company. So they could go and they could just start building, and it wasn't us during development switching our ideas and switching the concept. So it was well thought out, well planned. And so I think that's where we're coming back now with a solution that much more along the lines of what we expect. And we're confident in deploying.
That's fantastic. What's the next tool that you want to build, or what's the next service such as Humanitarian ID that you think is going to be essential for the humanitarian or development community? I'm thinking the next 5 years of your life. Is there, after you roll this out and you've handed it off and there's a team moving it forward, what are you going to be working on?
Yeah, well, I mean, to be honest, the only thing that's in my head right now, or not much more, is this project ready, because it's going to go into quite an intense period over the next few months. But there's a few different projects I think that I want to put some focus on. One is really reviewing how we as a humanitarian community handle what's called 3W data, who's doing what where data. OCHA in the past had a big, monstrous, centralized tool that went away in 2009. And now we're looking at how do we do that. And I'm involved in a project called the Humanitarian Exchange Language. And the first thing they started working on was the standardization of 3W tagging. And now they're looking at, let's say, some simple tools for data cleaning, for data visualization. So we're engaging through that project. And I think that'll be something that we're hoping we'll start to see outputs for in the second half of this year. But on top of that, I want to start combining, and we have already, I did in the Philippines, where we combine data that came from social media and also there's a website or a project called GDELT, which collects news in over 100 languages from around the world, and it takes this unstructured data and it structures it in terms of organization, location, theme, and so on. And actually, they've already set up a service for us to pull out what looks like 3W data. So what I want to do in the next sort of year or so is figure out ways to combine the traditional data that we would get in through our partners, through these Hexol-related tools, HXL tools, combine that with data that the Digital Humanitarian Network can find for us through social media and other channels, as well as what's coming from news media, and finding a way to put that together. And the purpose, when people hear me talk, is I want to bring this data and I want to essentially, these are a couple extra big data sources to augment something that we already have. I'm not going to create new projects or products. I'm not going to create new maps out of this social media data or the news data. I want to add that behind the regular 3W products or infographics. So when a responder sees the OCHA, who's doing what where, he or she sees something that they are used to. However, it's much more filled out in terms of data, but it looks like something they're used to. They're not shocked by, this is a new product, how does it relate to an old product? But here's the regular product, but it's just much more full. It's giving you a much more encompassing picture. A couple other things I've been working on for the last couple of years. One is the Digital Humanitarian Network, and this is bringing what are often referred to as the volunteer and technical community, either volunteer or non-volunteer based remote workers during emergencies. And we're looking at we've been doing this really on a volunteer basis the last 2 or 3 years, but how do we, I don't want to say formalize, but how do we structure this, make sure it's sustainable? How do we provide more coordination and collaboration amongst all the digital humanitarians during crises? Because they can add huge values as long as we get the right coordination and the right connections to those in the field and they're answering the right questions. And another one that it's sort of been popping up is how do we provide a platform for responders, not in terms of a social network concept, but a space where responders can, maybe you've checked in with Humanitarian ID and you're a verified user. So how can you check into some kind of space that allows you to freely have a discussion on a discussion board, add photos from your assessment, or, as more and more materials being added to Relief Web or Humanitarian Response, it's showing up in this sort of collaborative type space. And it's very, very early on. It's very, very rough thinking. But this is one that I'm starting to think about, like how can we enable that collaboration? I think many of the technical tools are becoming much more suitable for that. We all look at Facebook or Pinterest or these technical tools, but we couldn't do what they did 5 years ago. They had millions and billions of dollars. So now there's open source versions of social networks. There's things like OpenAtrium version 2, which would enable much more of these kind of ideas. So I'm hoping that we're moving into an age where these collaborative tools that people have been dreaming about for a long time become much more of a reality.
You've just talked about 4 or 5 different topics that I think would be enough to fill up their own podcast in each topic in themselves. I think it's fantastic. 2 more questions. One, tell me about the blog that you maintain. Why do you do that? Why is that important to you? Is it personal? Is it is it for you, better for you? Is it important for you professionally? And what is it that you get out of that?
So my blog, which is blog.veritythink.com. This was I started, I guess, probably 2 to 3 years ago, and it was some interesting discussions because I often sort of come up sometimes with really what I think are good ideas, like humanitarian ideas. Sometimes people might think my ideas are way off into a whole different realm, perhaps, maybe not so relevant. But I was coming up with these ideas and I was sharing them internally with a small group. And I said, well, why can't I share this externally? And with the purpose being that I very much want to get my ideas out there. I don't think that they are the right ideas. I don't think they're the final ideas, but I want to get my ideas out there so that one of 2 things: either people will say, "Hey, this is a really interesting idea. Let's collaborate and see what kind of solution we can take here," or people will tell me, that your idea is good because of this, or it's bad because of something else, or even if it's ideas to spur on other people's thinking and discussions. And it's been really interesting. I went in and I had a meeting with the Google Crisis Response team, and the thing they wanted to speak to me about was my concept of the humanitarian concierge. I have communicating with communities, individuals who are now trying to incorporate concepts into a blog post and actually a paper I wrote with a woman by the name of Victoria Lovrix about the affected persons information centers and how those could be established. So the point for me is that it's a way to get my ideas out and to help build a community for both myself, but also for the organization from an OCHA perspective. So although these ideas go out as my own personal ideas, it does have impact internally. It does help in some ways, put OCHA out there as at least a bit of a thinker on some of these information management, semi-technical topics and how they may affect the humanitarian space. So it's been very interesting. I blogged a few years ago about, how 3D printing could be used in humanitarian space. And, it's been interesting because I've seen that come to fruition. I've had practitioners who are doing it now, get in touch with me. Various different policy papers coming out of OCHA about the 3D printing. So it's very interesting in terms of building connections and helping formulate my own thinking. But the big point is I want to get my ideas out there and let's start working on these things. So rather than me just telling a few colleagues, it's like, no, let me write this down. It helps me formulate it in my own head in many ways. It really, I find, instigates a lot of interesting conversations with people.
And do you ever have a problem with corporate backlash or anything like that, or do you clear stuff with OCHA before you put it out there, or you sort of have a blanket that this is your thoughts coming out of your head and that's fine?
Yeah, there's a couple of points there. Before I put up the blog, it's because it's touching on professional topics that are related to my work. I had to get approval for the blog. That's a standard requirement. So that took a little bit of time, and I had to explain the style I was going to write and what I was going to write. And so for the first couple of blog posts that I wrote, I sent to my management. I said, here are the concepts. Here's the drawing that I want to put in, and here's the narrative, right? And I just sent this in like a Google document. And I said, go ahead and comment. And so they reviewed the first few, and they said, no, these are completely fine. But I write them knowing that when people read these, as much as I want to put a big stamp on there saying these are my personal thoughts, the people, they can simply Google my name and find out that I work for OCHA. So I know these things are, even if it's indirectly, are going to be associated to OCHA. So when I'm writing them, this is why I don't put out a blog post every day. I put out a blog post. It's probably averaging almost once a month. I have to spend a little bit more time crafting them and thinking about how would somebody interpret this to be in terms of OCHA's space. And it's interesting because I always tie this back to something my father taught me, and he was a teacher, and he says one of the things. I would see other adults behaving certain ways, and I asked him, well, why is it you don't do this, or why do they do that? And he said to me, he says, when you're a teacher, you're always a teacher. And especially as we grew up, I was in a small town. He says, everyone knows me as a teacher. It doesn't matter whether I'm inside the school or I'm outside the school. And so I look at it that I work for the United Nations, and whether I'm inside the office of the United Nations or whether I'm on the street in the village I live in, that's how I'm represented, and I have to take that into account. And I'm happy to do that. And so when I write, that's how I take. So I have had no backlash from the organization. I've actually had even recently a manager speak to me about, this is really great that not only for myself that, I can sort of build my own identity and brand in a way, but it does bring recognition to OCHA that, there are people inside of OCHA who are thinking about new ideas and what the future could hold.
The last question I have is one I ask everybody here on the Terms of Reference podcast, and that's simply, you took the leap way back in the day, and, you went to North Korea, you went to the Philippines, you stumbled your way into the humanitarian field, and you're thriving, you're successful, and not only that, but you're passionate, and you found a way to really make this a career that you're not only sustaining, but you find really satisfying. What's the one or two pieces of critical advice you'd give to somebody who's either coming out of a master's degree or interested in transitioning into this sector about how to replicate your success?
You sort of hit on one thing. I think especially if people are trying to enter into the field, my first thing is to be willing to go where other people aren't. This usually is going to get you into the field versus, say, a headquarters, but go where people aren't willing to often go. I'm not encouraging you to go to a disaster or conflict zone, but sometimes that's the reality. That can get you in. They can get you a lot of exposure, give you a lot of responsibilities early, gives you that field experience so that if you end up at a headquarters, you've got that base, you've got that understanding. But I think one of the things is there was a phrase I used yesterday the other day in a presentation of the Red Cross, and I think in the end what I said was just do different. We want to talk a lot about innovation. We want to talk about all these kind of concepts. But to me, it's like I remember coming out of university. I remember going into the private company, and I had lots of ideas. And I was seeing what the organization was doing, and I was saying, yes, but if you changed A, B, you would get C, but they wouldn't change A or B. And I was too junior; they wouldn't listen to me. So there is that challenge. So, sometimes it's you might get into a first job. It might seem difficult. Might be, people maybe don't listen to you, but trust your instincts. Be willing to speak up for what you believe. Be ready to back up what you speak about. But really don't stop thinking. Don't stop trying. Be willing to innovate. Be willing to do things differently. And maybe it's opportunist thinking in some ways, but I wrote an old blog post that talked about at the time of crises, whether it's a humanitarian disaster like I often respond to, or whether it's, say, a financial crisis in a private organization. This is the time when organizations are much more malleable. They're much more shapeable. Things can change. So don't let go of your ideas. Don't let go of the way, ideas and things that you would change. Keep those in mind. And if people aren't willing to listen when things are calm, maybe they'll listen when it's time to when there's an emergency. And that's really, I would say, one of my success stories in OCHA was the Libya crisis. And when everyone was leaving the country, they needed solutions. They needed a way to get information. And that's when I stepped forward and I said, I have a way that can get done, but it's different than the way we've been doing it before. And they said, we don't care. Just get it done. Okay, they didn't say we don't care, but I mean, it wasn't a carte blanche, but it was, okay, Andre, yes, we want you to go and get this information. Now, how are you going to do that exactly? So, that was when we started really collaborating with the volunteer technical communities, and that really changed the way I work, and it's changed many things. Even within the organization, there's been major impact. So sometimes it's those small little differences that you can bring in that also can have a huge impact.
Andre, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you giving up your time and telling us about not only humanitarian ID, but also these quite fascinating technical innovations that are coming down the pipe for the humanitarian community.
All right. Thanks a lot, Stephen. Thanks for having me on.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.